good morning to all of you, and those of you behind me. Excuse my back. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I don't think I've ever had breakfast with so many people. I know that you like to wake up early in Norway, but this is ridiculous, so many of you. But it's terrific to be with you. I really stand before you wearing three hats. Because I see myself very much as a daughter of Africa. I was born in the Sudan, in Khartoum. And then you may say to yourself, how could somebody who's lived in the United Kingdom since she was 2 years of age still claim to be a daughter of Africa? But I do. I also speak to you as chair of the Royal African Society, which is the oldest organization in the United Kingdom dedicated to furthering and promoting knowledge and a love of Africa, both within the United Kingdom and beyond. And I also talk to you as somebody who has been in the British media for several decades now. I started very early, and therefore I am particularly interested in the perception of Africans and Africa and how those perceptions have evolved over the years. So I have to say, as a daughter of Africa and somebody who's worked in the media who has seen over the years the cumulative effect of a rather negative image of Africa, it is always one that has jarred with me from when I was at school, going back to visit relatives in Khartoum with worried school friends inquiring if I was going to be taking enough food with me to last for the entire 6 weeks I was going to be staying in Sudan. It was things like that that made me realize, actually, from a very early age, that the kind of people I knew in Sudan and the kind of way that people were represented from the continent in the UK were really very, very different. And I've always, when it comes to Africa, have a very can-do mentality. I'm not delusional. I know that there are many challenges and so on. But when it comes to glass half full or half empty, I'm very much of the half full variety. And I think that the reason I've been like this is probably by way of my own family background, which I would just divert a little here to tell you. My great-grandfather was the pioneer of female education in the Sudan. So at the turn of the last century, he decided that he was going to educate his own daughters. Girls were all illiterate at that time. And he was criticized both by the British colonial authorities at the time and the community, saying, how can you do this, Sheikh Babakir? It's not something that we are used to. But he carried on, a man of great vision, of great courage, and of great tenacity, and he started a school and took his own girls there. He had many daughters because we say in the family that he was so pro-women, he married 4 of them. And so, the only blot on an otherwise blemish-free record, I have to say. But he had a lot of girls, and so he set his own example. And I have always taken the story of my great-grandfather as somebody who thought, things don't have to be the way they are. So I've always seen Africa through the lens of my family. So when we look today at Africa and what we can expect going forward, as somebody who's worked in news for many years, I'm less interested in the headlines and more in the trend lines when it comes to Africa, both politically, economically, and what I think is often overlooked culturally, because now in the continent there's a great deal of discussion. It may just be discussion, it may just be lip service, but at least there is some discussion now about the kind of universal values, civic values, human rights, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, that kind of thing, around, which African leaders are really beginning to talk about that. And I think that when you look, first of all, just very quickly at the political sphere, I think that the days of the old big African, leader are really behind us. Of course, there are still some who exist. You have Yoweri Museveni in Uganda, who's been in power for 3 decades. Of course, you have Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe. You have Eduardo dos Santos in Angola, Umar al-Bashir in Sudan, been in power since 1989. So you still do have some of those relics, you know. But on the whole, if you look at the political situation, it's more encouraging, I think, than not. And I think the one most recent and best example of the peaceful transfer of power in arguably Africa's most influential country, Nigeria, was really heartwarming when we saw how President Goodluck Jonathan conceded defeat very gracefully to Muhammadu Buhari and telephoned him and appealed to his followers to stay calm. I think that that really demonstrates how far Africa has come if this country of 180 million that has been so, you know, riven in the past by military coups and so on could have seen such a peaceful, you know, transfer of power from one civilian government to another. And I think that if you look at the recent months and so on, that is more or less held true. You know, we had a peaceful transfer of power in Zambia, concerns about some ethnic strife, but when Michael Sata died, you know, we've seen now an election that has brought President Lungu to power. Joyce Banda, who also, you know, lost the election and handed over to the brother of the former president, Peter Mutharika. So, you know, we have seen Mozambique, Armando Guebuza there, you know, in the elections. He was succeeded by President Nyusi. So I think on the whole, you can see that, you know, if you just look at this narrow picture of elections, you can see that actually you know, the picture is quite good. Of course, beneath that, there are, of course, some alarming, you know, signs or worrying signs, let's put it that way. I think that you can see in Africa, in several countries, forces which are inimical to democracy, what you could call one-party rule. Of course, with Frelimo in Mozambique, has been in power since 1975 when it got its independence from Portugal. Of course, in South Africa, you know, second biggest economy, very influential country in Africa. You can see, obviously, the ANC has been in power since 1994. I mean, you know, what can you do when I discuss this kind of thing? If a party wins elections, it's not exactly going to say, well, actually, we're going to hand over to the other guys because we don't think we should be in power. They have to be, but there are worrying concerns that, especially in a country like Mozambique, which I know for Norway is a country of great interest because of its huge natural gas reserves, where there is no bar on Frelimo officials and politicians being part of the business community there. And in fact, you do find that from the former president down, there have been a great many number of Frelimo politicians and officials who are extremely rich. President Guebuza, the former president, was rumored to be the richest man in Mozambique. You know, similar story in Angola with Dos Santos, where you get these vested interests, even if people are going through the ballot box and saying, legitimately, we've been elected and these are free and fair elections. The fact that they see, you know, power as a means to enriching themselves and their supporters through their system of patronage is a little bit concerning. But I think that, you know, on the whole, it's a little bit, you know, we talk a lot about the Arab Spring, and how I see Africa politically is a bit more like a Russian summer. If ever you've been to Russia, you know, it's like a week of really nice hot weather, and then you take a few steps back and it's cold again, and so on. So I think that it's a little bit like that, you know, but I feel that the trend lines on the whole are moving in the right direction. I think, though, there is obviously still, when it comes to politics, huge concern about instability, and there are some really tragic cases of instability, both ethnic strife, where there's no religious foundation to that strife, and then also obviously ethnic strife or just religious strife. So the ethnic strife variety would be South Sudan, for instance, where you have seen, you know, long-running hostilities between the Nuer, led by the Vice President Riek Machar, and the Dinka dominant tribe in South Sudan, led by the current President Salva Kiir. And that really is tragic. The United Nations published a report recently and said that, you know, the official figure is 10,000 dead in the last 15 months of ethnic strife and violence and communal violence between these two communities and a couple of million displaced, the true figure is undoubtedly much, much larger. Child soldiers being recruited on both sides. Both sides are not blame-free at all in this situation. So obviously there are concerns also. In Mozambique, there were concerns about ethnic strife, you know, the long-running civil war between Renamo and Frelimo, when Alfonso de la Cama, the leader of Renamo, went back into the jungle before the elections, and there was concern that, you know, ethnic strife would start again. And then, of course, the religious kind of strife, which captures the headlines very much, the activities of Boko Haram, largely in northeastern Nigeria, and of course Al-Shabaab in Kenya. That is something, of course, which is of extreme concern. You know, the Muslims in Kenya form about 10% of the population. In Nigeria, there's a more even split between the Christians and the Muslims. It would be interesting to see how this new Muslim president in Nigeria, who also was a you know, very accomplished, disciplined general when he was in the army, is going to deal with that. I think there are many, many reasons why we see this militant Islamic, or they claim to be Islamic. Of course, they're not really when they go around killing people. But you know, this kind of militant activities. There are many, many reasons why. A bit of this, a bit of that. But I think that undoubtedly part of it, without wanting to excuse them at all or to in any way justify their actions, there is undoubtedly a bit of an economic base to their grievances. You know, northeastern Nigeria, salaries there are half of what they are in the south. The illiteracy rate, the amount of money spent on education, is just a proportion in the north of what it is in the south. You know, this is something which is acknowledged by all Nigerian leaders. In Kenya as well, the Muslims there, often of Somali origin, feel that they've been marginalized, both politically and economically. And obviously then there is this kind of, you know, wider global jihadist appeal, which is also giving a larger, more sinister framework to their activities. But they are no different from other African citizens in the sense that they are saying this Africa Rising narrative, where we all know the kind of striking headlines of 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are African. Because I think that is one thing where most people now agree is there's no use just looking at GDP growth and so on. You know, you've had in Africa, by and large, jobless growth. And this is not something which is inclusive. This is not something which is sustainable, because there's no point just looking at, you know, high rates of growth, which are largely fueled by high oil prices, which have now gone down, of course, or high commodity prices, because the extractive industries don't provide a lot of employment at all, you know, in Africa. So I think that that is something which is very much recognized economically, that you've got to have the kind of growth which really does, you know, filter down from the top of the pyramid down, and that looking at GDP rates is really not enough. You've got to look at average household incomes to make sure that people are, you know, everybody is benefiting. I mean, the average per capita income in sub-Saharan Africa is just under $1,500 per annum, and for many people it's much, much less than that. And I think that one aspect when you look in Africa, about Africa, and it's difficult, of course, to talk about an entire continent, but there are these trend lines, I think, which transcend national borders, is the fact that Africa is a very, very young continent. So the average age in Japan is 44, in the United Kingdom in 40, in Uganda is 15. And that just gives you an idea, you know, 60% of Africans under the age of 18 or 70% under the age of 35, that these young people in Africa are demanding to be part of their societies. These are not people who buy the arguments of their governments that this is the colonial inheritance, that the international economic system is loaded against us, that there's this, that, and the other. No, these young Africans see that the real agents of change in their lives are their own governments. They hold their own governments to account. And that is a very different picture. It's the picture I've always known. It's a very different picture from how how Africa is depicted in the international community, whereby it's either seen as a kind of one vast pipeline in which to extract its riches, or as the recipient of donor aid. Now, I'm not saying donor aid, and I know Norway throughout the decades has been extremely generous, and that there is this pledge by Western nations who try to meet, 0.07% of GDP is overseas development aid, and it is important. But even a country like Ethiopia, which officially says now that it depends on 20% of its budget on overseas aid, says no country in history has ever been developed by foreign aid. And, the young people of Africa know this. The governments are beginning to recognize this. And so, thank you. When you go to Africa and you talk to people, you see that both locally, domestically, nationally, regionally, and continent-wide, people are saying we have to look to ourselves. So we've seen many grand visions come and go over the years. We've had, NEPAD, the New Partnership for Africa's Development. Now, we've had most recently in the last year or so the launch of Agenda 2063, which is a kind of economic blueprint for the development of Africa from the African Union and the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. And they say, look, we're going to fund this grand vision of Africa in sort of 10-year, bites, where we have a 10-year plan to develop infrastructure, and all the rest of it. And we believe that this will be funded 80% domestically. So people are looking at domestic resource mobilization, curbing illicit financial flows, increasing the tax revenue, because, taxation in Africa is extremely low. Corporate and personal, on average, is about 11% across the whole continent. Some countries might do a bit better, 15%. And tax is very, very important. You're all taxed, the West is all taxed, because not only is it a valuable source of revenue, both from households and also, of course, corporations, both foreign and domestic, it also gives a connection, accountability between a government and its people. Trevor Manuel, the former South African finance minister, said aid is spelled TAX, because it is that important. So I think, from my point of view, it's heartening to see that those thoughts that I had as a schoolgirl when I thought, no, this isn't the picture of Africa. When I go, I hear people in the family talking about this is what we want our government in Khartoum today. They don't expect anybody from the outside to come and do it for them. That is really very much the zeitgeist in Africa at the moment. So when you say Africa is rising, myth or reality, I say it is rising. You've got to ask, who is it rising for? It must rise for everybody. But certainly, I think Africans very much see themselves now in the driving seat. Lip service, perhaps in some cases, myth sometimes in other cases, but at least they are now talking, in the correct way. And I think that, when it comes to us saying that Africa is changing or has changed, I would say yes, it has. And therefore, that is why, although I've lived in the UK since I was a small child, I still say I am very proud to be a daughter of Africa, because it is fashionable to be African now. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. We'll move on to Professor Tronvoll. Please, welcome.
Good morning, all sammen. Yes, I'm going to speak a bit about both the positives and negatives we do see on the continent today. And you started with asking, is 2015, will it be the year of transformations for Africa? Well, that's an easy answer to that, yes, because all years are years of transformations in Africa, for good and for not so good. Clearly, as Zeinab also pointed to, there has been an impressive growth over the last decade or two in Africa as such, but more so on particular individual countries. The primary drivers for this growth has been private consumption and investments, which are expected to become increasingly more important in the coming years too. Government consumption is also filling up rather well. About 23% or so of the GDP growth stems from government consumptions, which is basically infrastructure development as such. The attractiveness of private capital to the continent has also increased dramatically over the last 2 decades. But still, African diaspora invest more in their home countries than foreign private companies. And that's a bit remarkable, in my view. The biggest FDI, or the biggest foreign currency source for Africa, is still the African diaspora, sending money back home, and both for investment, but also for private consumptions. All the forecasts tells us that the economy on the continent will continue to grow in the years to come. However, we do see some obstacles to a sustainable high-level growth as we have experienced over the last 15 years or so. Since my work primarily focuses on political security risks analysis, that's where I'm going to focus my brief intervention here today. However, not overlooking all the positives which are there. So it's not to scare you off, but just to draw your attention to some of the more challenging factors we also meet when we do invest or do work on the African continent. And again, let me just first excuse myself when we say Africa and African continent. It's 55 different countries with a tremendous diversity economically, culturally, politically. So we have a bit to simplify it into continental trends is difficult, but let me try a bit, nevertheless. I have grouped together 5 different set of risk factors we need to be aware of when working on the continent. And obviously, since I have 8 minutes left, I cannot delve too deep into these 5 different set of risk factors, but let me touch just the surface of it. First factor, the structural economic risks. We see the economy today in Africa is very much similar to what the economy looked like post-independence decade. It is very heavily reliant on agriculture and subsistence agriculture. The extraction of natural resources, and then traditional and basic services, which is more or less impossible to measure in our economic terms, since it is not listed or not assessed in a formal economic sector. This lack of diversification in the African economies is the main challenge when also doing investments in Africa. Which is also makes the continent and countries more vulnerable to the fluctuations of commodity prices, oil prices, and so on. And you see now for 2015, sadly, the largest number of downgrades of countries due to the global political and economic risks happens in Africa. Countries by countries are downgraded because of global economic factors. You have another set of risks related to then economic governance, if you may call it that. And it is not to hide that many of the African countries still have both regulative law instruments and also a political climate which harks back to the one-party communist setup of states. So 15 out of 20 global countries where it is most difficult to do businesses, 15 of 20 are in Africa. Many of these regulative mechanisms are in the process to change. It's transforming day by day, but the cultural of bureaucracy, to call it like that, is having an inertia of change. Africa doesn't rank well also on the competitive indexes we do have, and also the huge challenges of illicit financial flows impacts the industry on the continent. It is estimated that illicit financial flows range between 30 to 60 billion US dollars a year from Africa. So Africa is a net creditor to the world and not the other way around. The third set of risks we need to be aware of is the contextual risk, you can call it, which might happen, because of the the infrastructure or the environment you are working in. And this is not particular to Africa, but you have some peculiar risk factors there we don't find any other places. Like the Ebola crisis in the West African business, how that has also impacted not only the social humanitarian consequences, but definitely also the economic structures of these three countries. Both the institutional quality and the supply chain has suffered dramatically in Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. You have issues, of course, related to political stability and instability. We can come back to that in our discussions, I believe, and then the so-called terrorist attack, which is a new trend. Until 2010, you had a very positive development of less conflicts in Africa over the last 20 years, from 1990 to 2010. A radical decrease of armed violence. Since 2010, however, you have an increase of armed violence in Africa, which is very worrying and might also hit the industry, obviously. You have climate changes and freak weather incidents, which are prone to the agriculture sector in particular. The fourth set of risks is then pure the security sector, security risks assessments. Which I said, you have had positive trends, but then the last few years, some negative developments. And this is particularly related to country cases, which still are prone to conflict, and Zeinab mentioned a few of them, seem to be long-term recurrent conflict scenarios in the main countries like the DRC, South Sudan, Central African Republic, and so on and so forth. You do have, if you break down the continent in the regional spheres, we do like to talk about Africa in the northern, the Sahel belt, West Africa, sorry, east and south. Most of these geographical areas have challenges related to security risks issues. The geographical areas which have escaped that is Southern Africa and Eastern Africa. But again now, the most recent trends, as we witnessed just during Easter too, the spread of terrorist networks, as they are labeled, Al-Shabaab in particular in East Africa, will pose a more increasing challenge to the well-established businesses in Kenya, but also in Uganda and Tanzania are prospects to suffer for Al-Shabaab and other related activities one should be aware of. Then, coming to the final on political risks, I very much agree with the tremendous positive developments in terms of political accountability in a democratic sense we have experienced in Africa over the last 20 to 30 years. And the majority of the countries have a constitutional setup. This is liberal multi-party democracy. They conduct regular elections. And illustratively enough, the Nigerian elections passed the true test where incumbent steps down and pass on the presidency to his opponent in an admirable manner. But nevertheless, we see more and more entrenchment of constitutional democracy in Africa. We see a more worrying trend parallel to that, where the rule of law sector are being used to curb political opposition, to curb civil society, to curb media and other activities. New media laws, new civil society laws, new anti-terror laws are being gazetted in all countries, more or less, very much restricting a sphere of community of society, which the private sector is very dependent on, because these are the watchdogs and checks and balances to governmental power. The media, the civil society, the activists, and they are being put under very much stronger control, more or less in all countries on the continent. And this is again a global trend. We don't see that only in Africa, but all over. That have the potential also to hurt the industry in a time to come, because it is less transparency and less accountability to political power and corruption for that matter. The overall, if you can call macro trends on political and security risks, I also think I'm going to end with a more positive note. I think the backsliding we have experienced over the last 5 years is possibly a temporary backsliding, and the overall trend are still pointing in the right way when it comes to more political and security stability on the continent. But for the private sector, it shows that you need to be more aware of the context you're operating in and need to invest possibly a bit more in understanding that context and the trajectories of political and security risks in each individual country. And I thank you for that.
And last but not least, Mr. Jon Vea, please, the floor is yours.
Good morning to all of you, and good morning to my previous speakers. I very much would like to emphasize that I, to a very large extent, share the analysis of Zeinab when it comes to the situation in Africa. But when I reflected on how I should try to bring in some aspects here, I focus on certain elements which I would like to draw your attention to. I think at least I really feel so kind of happy that Africa has taken off. It took off kind of in 2000, 2002. I think we have to understand what were the drivers for this very positive development, economic and political development in Africa since 2002. We have touched on some of them already, and I think the first is that I think in 2002, 2003, when the economist described Africa as the failed continent, I think Africa had slowly, to some extent, matured and was ready for a kind of takeoff. Africa is the most, I would say, resourceful continent on the earth, and it's the continent where so much resources are not exploited yet. Take, for instance, the agriculture. Africa is, or could be, the breadbasket of the world, actually. I think Angola, I have my 4 or 5 years in Angola, so I know that country particularly well. But I think if the agricultural potential in Angola was exploited to the full extent, the World Bank assessed that Angola could feed 900 million people. That country. It's not a small country. It's 7 times the size of continental Norway. So it's a big country. But I mean, if you take the agricultural sector, if you take the commodity area, if you take oil and gas, if you take hydropower as an example, Africa is so resource rich. But these resources haven't been exploited. I think in 2002, 2003, I think the timing was there for a kind of takeoff. I think what Zeinab emphasized is so right. You have to have a level of peace and stability. If you don't have peace, if you don't have stability, you won't have growth. You will have setbacks, and you have had that in so many African countries. Take DRC as an example, Congo. Congo is such a resource-rich country, but it has been in constant conflict since 1995. Take the fantastic potential of the Inga project. I mean, to make a huge dam of Congo and the world's biggest hydropower project there, or a plant. It could be 1.5 size the Three Gorges in China, but nothing happens. Why? Because of the risk link to investing, to go into DRC at the time. And it has been like that for 20 years now. That dam alone could kind of supply a huge part of Africa with electricity, if that could materialize. But it can't because of lack of stability, lack of predictability, lack of governance, all these things that we have touched upon. These things are decisive. But still, in 2002, 2003, there was a time where it became more stable, more predictable, and one element that has not been mentioned, which I attach importance to, is the entrance of China to Africa. China kind of started to grow in Africa in 2002, and during 10 years, the trade between China and Africa increased 10 times, from plus minus 10 billion US dollars to 130, 40 billion dollars. In Angola alone, the trade went from $2 billion to $30 billion in that period. Of course, that had impact. China took the commodities, contribute to high prices of the commodities, came in with investments, started to develop infrastructure in a manner that Africa haven't seen before. So I think China has been decisive, important, and will continue to be. It's sometimes difficult for us to kind of fully accept that China has played such an important role, because we have been skeptical to the Chinese model that in many respects challenged the European approach to Africa, the Norwegian way of doing aid to Africa, etc. So I think that's one important element. I also very much agree that you can't really look at GDP growth. It's important, it's one parameter to see that there is growth in Africa. And we always say that 6 out of 10 countries in Africa are among the leading when it comes to GDP growth. But Africa consists of 54 countries. I think what is a little bit alarming, of course, is that you see, at the same time as you see growth, you see increase also more inequality in many African countries. And that, to a large extent, threatens the stability. Again, you have an urbanization process. You see young people in millions going towards the big cities. What are they meeting there? They come full of expectation, but what do they meet? They hope for jobs. But the growth we have seen, and again I share the view, hasn't created jobs. A huge portion of the youth in African countries get some kind of income from the informal sector. Very few are working in a formal sector. This is a little bit disturbing. Not a little bit, it is disturbing, because you have the big cities with millions of young people not having jobs. It's kind of ticking bomb, in my view, because these people, they want, and as I said, they want to challenge their governments. They want to have jobs. How to create jobs? A last element which I would like to bring forward is this. It's so important, but still it's a little bit simplifying to put so much enthusiasm and believe in private sector development. It's, of course, it's important, but there is a huge responsibility of the private sector also, if you shall achieve this goal. How to create jobs, for instance. The petroleum-driven economies in many African countries have created so few jobs. How can there be positive effects when it comes to employment due to the oil activities? Well, here I think we are also touching on one of the bottlenecks in many African countries. That's lack of capacity and competence in government, in the governments, in utilities and so forth that deals with these questions. Because you have to challenge continuously the private sector in order to get balanced approach. I think Zambia is a good example of how little a country the government of a country get of the revenues from the extraction of minerals in that country. In the oil sector, a more fair share is going to the governments. But the problem is that the revenues, the huge revenues, are not really spread among the population. And I think we will see more and more unrest in the cities if the governments are not able to create jobs. But I think then it's very important that you can also have new type of partnership between authorities, governments, host countries, donor countries, and private sector in order to establish a common view of responsibility when it comes to these issues of job creation and so forth, because it's so important for the continuation of the growth, for the stability in these countries. There are things that are so important also for the continuation of the growth in Africa, and that's infrastructure, of course. Roads, those of us that have traveled in Africa see how impossible it is and how frustrating it is if you encourage a farmer to produce more maize or other products. They cannot bring the products to the market because the roads are not at all functioning during the rainy season. Infrastructure is so important. Energy, I think 75% of the population, 80% of the population in Africa has no access to modern energy services. Some business people, and I think they are right also, are saying that without access to energy, there will be no economic development, no growth. Energy is not the only factor, but it's so important. And if you look at other countries that have had continuous growth, they have been so clever in kind of organizing their energy supply. China, Vietnam, these countries have really been ahead of the economic development. I mean, they have, or their energy development of the energy sector has been ahead of the industrial development, actually, because they know that without energy, you won't really get the economic growth. Now we are also distributing not only energy to the business, to the industry, to that sector, but we also now are talking about energy to the people. There are so many 100 million people that have no access to light, no access to modern cooking facilities. These are important issues, and the world has kind of agreed that we should have a common approach to this. We have developed sustainable energy for all, the UN initiative. We have put up, and Norway has been pushing for that, a new sustainable development goal on energy. These things has to be addressed, but there is a question of hundreds of billions of dollars in the next decade if we shall achieve these goals. And then I think the professor here addressed very rightly the risks, the perception of risks still, if you want to go to Africa. How shall you make the African continent to a market where business really feel that they can go in and invest to the extent that is needed to continue to maintain this growth that we have seen? That is a very, very big challenge. Because when there is a high risk, the cost of financing is also very, very high. The expectation of profit on investments in Africa is so high. Sometimes it's prohibitive, because you have this expectation of a 25% profit of your investments. It's kind of ridiculous, but that is the situation because of the assessment people have of the risk still in Africa. So this has to be addressed, I think, if we shall be able to maintain, contribute to the growth in Africa. I think I end by this, and let's have a discussion on this.